taking from the bottom, taking from the middle, and giving it to the richest people among us.
What if the single biggest financial struggle in your life, that feeling that you're working harder but getting nowhere, isn't your fault? What if it's part of a 40-year plan you were never meant to notice? In this video, with renowned economist Professor Richard Wolff, we expose the brutal reality of the American economy. We're not just going to show you that the system is rigged. We're going to show you how it was rigged, who signed the orders, and what the devastating consequences are for you and your family. By the end of this video, you will never look at your country, your leaders, or your money the same way again.
The single most important problem of the American economy that everyone really knows is the fact that we are now one of the most unequal economies in the world. Taking from the bottom, taking from the middle, and giving it to the richest people among us. Let me give you the statistics today, how unequal we are, and then go back and show you how and why the big, beautiful bill is really ugly. All right, I'm going to start with the bottom half of the American people. The bottom half. We are a country of 330 million, so I am talking about 165 million Americans, half our people. Together, the bottom half have today 2.5% of the wealth in this country. Now let's take the next 40% of the people. They're richer, they have more than the bottom half, but less than the top 10%. So we've talked about the bottom half, 50%, now the next 40%, what you might call the middle of the United States. How much wealth do the middle of the United States enjoy? 30%. Notice, less than their share of the population. If the bottom half get only 2.5%, and the middle, so we're now talking about the 90% of our people out of 330 million, they get 30%. That leaves the remaining amount, 2/3 of the income of this country is in the hands of the top 10% of our people.
The numbers are staggering, and they are confirmed by the Federal Reserve's own data, which show the bottom 50% of Americans own just 2.5% of the wealth. 90% of our population, that's you, your neighbors, your family, gets to live on about 1/3 of the nation's wealth. The top 10% keeps the other 2/3. But even that doesn't capture the whole picture. Ready for a fact that should shake this country to its core? The 400 wealthiest Americans now own more wealth than the bottom 200 million Americans combined. It raises a provocative question. In a country where 90% of the people live on 1/3 of the wealth, can we truly have one person, one vote? To answer that, you have to understand that this didn't happen by accident.
Over the last 40 years, to be crystal clear, we have had a redistribution of wealth in the United States. Not the one that Republicans and Democrats worry we might have and have to avoid. No, I'm not talking about that fantastic one which never happened. I'm talking about the real one that happened that we don't discuss, although we should, which is a redistribution upward.
An upward redistribution, a reverse Robin Hood. For 40 years, wealth has been systematically pulled from the bottom and middle and funneled directly to the top. And it was all made legal through a series of specific political decisions. It ignited in the 1980s under Reaganomics, with massive tax cuts for the highest earners and the weakening of unions. The top tax rate was slashed from 70% down to 50% in 1982. It continued through the 2000s with the Bush tax cuts, again benefiting the highest income brackets. But the most recent and perhaps most blatant move was the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act.
Now, please keep that in your mind when I tell you that the only significant economic act that was passed by and through President Trump's first presidential term was the tax cut of 2017, passed in December of that year. It gave an enormous tax cut to corporations and the rich, precisely the people who needed it least. This will make inequality worse, just like his first tax cut for them did.
And now, in 2025, a new bill has just passed the Senate, making many of these devastating tax cuts permanent. I know what you might be thinking, but I was told these tax cuts create jobs and prosperity for everyone. It's a powerful myth. The reality? The data shows a different story. Since 2017, corporations have used their tax windfalls not for employee wages, but for record-breaking stock buybacks and dividends, enriching their shareholders and top executives. Take PepsiCo. Between 2021 and 2023, as they raised prices on you, they funneled $21 billion back to their shareholders instead of new investments. Comcast did the same, handing out $43 billion while laying off 3,000 workers. The wealth isn't trickling down, it's being siphoned up. But for all this to make sense, there's one more piece of the puzzle you have to see. You have to see how different life could be.
In France, twice in recent years, the government tried to do the kind of step towards inequality we're doing here. And both times, the French people did the same thing. Out into the streets they went. Their left-wing political parties, their progressive parties, their anti-capitalist parties led them into the street and said, this country will not go to that level of inequality. And let me remind you, for those who may not know, the next time you hear an American politician say, we're the greatest country, remember what I just told you.
It's a bold statement, but let's look at the facts. What does life look like in a country that refuses to accept this level of inequality? Let's start with time off. In the US, there is no federal law for mandatory paid vacation. In France, every single employee is legally entitled to 5 weeks of fully paid vacation every year. Now, healthcare. In America, medical bills are the #1 cause of personal bankruptcy. They account for over 66% of cases. We've all heard the horror stories. Families like the Wards from Chicago, who faced an $80,000 bill after their twins were born prematurely, forcing them into a decade of debt despite having insurance. In France, healthcare is a fundamental right. It's a universal, government-funded system where citizens are covered from birth to death. Higher education? In the US, the average student debt is crushing. In France, public universities are almost free, with symbolic tuition fees of around $175 a year for a bachelor's degree. This isn't a fantasy, it's a political choice. They choose to tax their wealthy citizens and corporations to build a decent society for everyone. We choose to tax our middle and lower classes to make the rich even richer. This relentless 40-year transfer of wealth has brought America to a breaking point. It's created a society of despair for the many and unimaginable luxury for the few. And this is where Professor Wolff delivers his most chilling warning.
We are making our society a society of extreme inequality. And history teaches us, if it teaches us anything, that in the long run, as masses of people understand the inequality imposed on them, and what it costs them in careers they can't have, in jobs they can't get, in income they can't enjoy, in promotions denied to them. As it becomes clear that that's what an unequal society produces, they will not tolerate it. And then the bad news comes. As the people at the top realize that the long-term payoff to taking more than a fair share is you lose it all. It's happened over and over again. And to those who think it can't happen here, watch. It is happening here. It's not sustainable what we are doing in this country.
This isn't about politics. It's about reality. The path we are on is unsustainable. So what can we do? The solution starts not in the streets, but in your mind. It starts by changing the way you see the world. Here is your action plan. First, the next time a politician promises a tax cut for corporations will benefit you, remember the data. Remember PepsiCo and Comcast. Ask the hard question. Where is the proof? The truth is, the benefits don't trickle down, they flow up. Second, understand that crushing student debt, unaffordable health care, and working 2 jobs just to get by are not personal failures. They are symptoms of a system designed to produce exactly these outcomes. Your struggle is a piece of a much larger story. And third, share this knowledge. The reason this continues is because, as Professor Wolff says, we don't discuss it. Send this video to your family, your friends. Talk about the real numbers. A population armed with the truth is the only thing that can challenge a system built on lies. We began with a single quote, taking from the bottom, taking from the middle, and giving it to the richest people among us. Now you know how it's done. You've seen the 40-year playbook, you've seen the devastating numbers, and you've seen that another way is possible. The feeling that the game is rigged isn't just in your head, it's in the data. But understanding is the first and most powerful step toward demanding change. If the comparison between the American and French models shocked you, you won't want to miss our next video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next journey.